Yes, it's in progress. So welcome everybody. We just did a short round of introductions. So without much ado, I introduce myself. My name is Alessandra Arcuri. I'm professor of international economic law at the Erasmus School of Law. And I will start by sharing some of my thoughts on the award, and will then pass the floor to Anil Yilmaz, and Tony Marzal will conclude, and they will introduce themselves. So the floor is mine. Yes, let's see. Share. Okay. Can you all see it? Yes. Perfect. So I start with the title and the main thesis of what, to me, is the main gist of my message. And I start by paraphrasing Groucho Marx. This award may look like it's perverse and may be written like it is perverse, but don't let that fool you. It really is perverse. And it is perverse on two accounts. On account of its effects, it's clearly an anti-environmental and anti-democratic award in its effect. So even if lawful is awful, but it's also perverse, I think, on a more legal doctrinal level. So when you really dig down into the rules and how they have been understood and applied, is highly problematic. Why? So before answering this question, I want to have two premises on the question of environmental pollution of the fossil fuel industry. In this slide, you see that there are various dimensions, and the number 3, which relates to climate change, is something we hear often. Ocean acidification as well. We hear about that from air pollution caused by the burning fossil fuel, number 2. But the number 1 is somehow less discussed, and this the pollution from upstream extraction on local communities and environment. There is some literature, a paper by Johnson and other colleagues, who gives a fair good overview of the typology of pollutions from upstream extraction of hydrocarbons, and this includes contamination of water, drink and surface, marine pollution, impact on wildlife and agriculture, soil pollution, high mortality and morbidity risks, particularly from flaring and oil spills. So these are important environmental and human health consequences that also contribute to overshooting our planetary boundary. The second premise is that the fossil fuel law, which is the laws we have that enable the fossil fuel economy, is not a law that is God-given. It's a law that has been shaped by the lobbying efforts of the fossil fuel industry. And by now we have a rich literature, socio-legal literature, like the popular book Merchants of Doubt, which shows how the fossil fuel industry has fostered climate denialism, has manufactured doubts, and has implemented strategies to delay regulation. Another important point is that the change for a more sustainable world is coming often from social mobilization. There are various examples you can think of, such as climate litigation, by scientists who resist the systematic harassment from the industry. There is a very interesting source, that is the Environmental Justice Atlas, that documents many battles in which environmental activists have brought about change. And in a paper I'm writing that relates, closely related to the Rockhopper case, I'm trying to make a link that rational ecological regulation is closely related to deep democracy, so that we need to distantiate ourselves from the technocratic myth and understand how deep democracy actually enables good environmental law, which hopefully is something that environmental lawyers already know, but that's not always the case. All right, so let's go to the case. A very brief summary for those of you who do not know about it. Probably most people in this virtual and physical room know about it. But in 2017, Rockhopper has lodged a complaint before an international arbitration tribunal because it was denied a permit for cultivating hydrocarbons at about 6.5 kilometers off the coast of Italy. Sometimes I'm meeting people. You can do? Okay. On 24 August 2022, the news broke that Rockhopper has been awarded $119 million plus interest vis-a-vis of an investment of about $40 million. Since about 4 weeks, we know that the main findings are on direct expropriation. So there was no consideration of fact or legitimate expectation. It was all about direct expropriation. And finally, in October 2022, Italy filed a request for annulment. All right. Oops. Voilà. Now, I want to start with commenting on the award, but mainly on what the award omits, because the award starts to establishing the facts. And when I was reading the award, I noticed that actually there were some facts that were omitted from the recollection of the tribunal. This is how lawyers sometimes write stories, right? This is a legal story. It doesn't tell all the story. So let's look at the story. And I apologize. I see that my Mac slides have been changed in this other digital environment. I hope I will clarify with words what is not clear in the slide. So very shortly, in 2005, a permit for exploration of hydrocarbons was given to the company Intergas, which then became Medoil Gas Italia SPA. I think someone has the mic on. And in 2008, people were living in that area. We are talking of Abruzzo, which is a part in the center, about the center of Italy, in the Adriatic Sea. The people woke up and saw this gigantic jackup rig about 6 kilometers from this coast. They were quite shocked. And not very pleased with the idea that a platform would have been there to extract oil. But in 2010, on the other side of the ocean, there is one of the major marine catastrophes in history, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And this led to the adoption of an Italian law that was prohibiting offshore drilling in Italy within 5/12 nautical miles. This is a bit technical, but let's say that the platform of Ombrina Mare, which is the main project of the Rockhopper case, was within this distance from the coast. Now, in the fact of the tribunal at paragraph 97, we find a number of facts which is concluded with the fact that there was a positive environmental impact assessment. It is correct that on 30th of June there was such an assessment, but they omit to say that there was also an environmental impact assessment which kind of closed this procedure, which was negative, is number 541 of 7 October 2010. That's not in the award. It's not too relevant, but it's interesting that in the story is untold. Then there is a turn of event. There is this negative opinion, and following this negative opinion, the Ministry of the Environment should have denied the permit. That is where the story should have ended according to a physiological legal system. But it took 2 years for the Ministry of the Environment to not act upon this negative environmental impact assessment. In 2012 and then in 2014, there have been 2 law decrees by the Monti and the Renzi government that introduced exceptions to the 2010 law. by this exception, the Ombrina project was again possible. What is the ratio of this exception? According to some Italian media, is lobby of Medoil. So on this slide, you see a letter that was sent by the then CEO of Medoil to the Minister of Environment, Corrado Clini at the time, thanking him for this wonderful law adopted. So some people say, well, this is like pure lobbying. There is also a rationale that is mentioned in the award in paragraph 102. We see that the respondent specifically took this step, so to carve out an exception, so that the project that for which there was a submission for obtaining an extractivist permit would have been exempted from the prohibition. Some called the Ombrina Mare exception. And in the award, we read the respondent specifically took this step to avoid litigation and claims for damage from such companies. Now, we don't know if this a fear of a claim relates to ISDS or to claims under Italian law. But if it would be ISDS, here we have really an anti-regulatory self-fulfilling prophecy. You adopt a law because you are afraid of a claim, and that law is your the main ground by which you will be condemned to pay an incredible amount of damage 10 years later. Anyway, in this context, in 2014, Rockhopper buys Medoil. On this, I want to open a little parenthesis that it doesn't really strictly relate to the award, but it relates to the territory where this is taking place and what people thought of this project. Very quickly, I want to mention that Abruzzo has been a territory which has been targeted by the oil industry since the 70s. And it has an important history of resistance to a petrolized economy. Fast forwarding to the days when the Ombrina Mare project was initiating, there were also other projects, and the people resisted all of these three projects, the Centro Oli, the Ombrina Mare, and Lake Bomba gas extraction. The Medoil project is the only one that continued to insist. And after there was, of course, in 2010, there seemed to be a victory for the people. But then after the 2012 law, there has been the mobilization has resumed. In 2013, there were 40,000 people in Pescara, which is a small town, and in 2015, even a bigger demonstration. Next to this immense demonstration, it's important to note that the resistance against the offshore oil drilling was on all levels. So we are not talking of left, right. There was left politician, right politician. The church was very involved. So all section of society. It was really a massive opposition to this type of economic development. And in this context also, there were many observations submitted for the environmental impact assessment, discussing the risks that such projects entail. So what are the reasons that can be summarized from this popular resistance? Some were supported by the science with capital S, basically contesting the energy policy underpinning the decree that is, of course, based on fossil fuel, and renewable should have been the strategy then. But then there is also other scientists, and that's a point that I want to make, also to go back to the idea that sometimes change comes from the bottom up, and it is an important paradigm to understand better environmental regulation, because the evidence of the pollution from such extractivist project doesn't come necessarily from studies mandated from authority at the top. And besides a rich literature on that, I had the opportunity also to see a little bit in the field, because when I went to Abruzzo to make some interviews, at one point we asked to the people, but you have been so successful in resisting. You are not like the people in Basilicata. Basilicata is a region in the south of Italy where the real oil extractivism takes place. And they told us, you're wrong. We learned a lot from Basilicata. So what is happening in Basilicata? In Basilicata, it's where there is the so-called experiential knowledge, if we want to borrow terms of philosophy of scientists, such Donna Haraway. And there it's where the extraction of about 80% of all hydrocarbons in Italy takes place. And that is where the people started to experience what does it mean to have the largest water reservoir being contaminated. They started to experience together with scientists, because the local authorities were not monitoring, and the process of getting to this evidence was a process of struggle. There were scientists taking the samples, policemen arrested to do their job. It was not like a smooth process. And this is, Basilicata is just as many other places where oil extractivism takes place. Because I have to go back to the award, I just close with one quote about the people of this region that says, until yesterday, for people of Lucania, the soil was an element of cultural and social identification. Today, they think that natural resources could be compromised, and this changed profoundly their identity. In their imaginary nature, and let me get to the quote here because there is not very clear, in their imaginary nature has been transformed from source of life to a death risk. So there is a potentially a very transformative impact in a place where oil extractivism starts to occur. Let's go back to our case. On 6 July 2015, there is a mobilization after there has been the law that gives the exception, and people start to resist. They realize the only thing that we can do is to go to referenda. So there is an incredible mobilization for so-called no-triv referenda, so no drilling referenda, to abolish some of the key rules introduced by the two law decrees, among other things. And there is a request from from 10 regions in Italy, but also support by a conference of region. And this comes officially after there has been the positive evaluation of the technical committee of the ministry, in Italian called Autorizzazione Integrata Ambientale, which is a key document in the award, as we see in a minute. The Renzi government is pressed to pass the stability law, by which offshore drilling is outlawed, including the exceptions. So Ombrina is denied and Rockhopper is denied the permit. And this brings me to the more substantive findings in the award, and I will focus on expropriation. Anil and Tony will focus on the other dimensions. So the tribunal reasoning for finding expropriation is made in 3 steps. The first thing that the tribunal does is to establish as fact something about Italian law. There is a decree 404 of 94, which is enforced, they say. And this decree says, I quote, the Ministry of Economic Development, within 15 days from the receipt of environmental compatibility decree by the Ministry of the Environment, issues the decree for the award of the production concession. You remember, I just said that there was in August this issuance of the decree of environmental compatibility. So they say it is a fact that this decree is enforced, this article of this decree. The second step is they say, given that there is this norm in force, it follows that the claimant held a right to be granted the production concession. So there is this category of right to be granted the production concession. And then they use this nice metaphor that the Rubicon has been crossed with this decree. And the third step is that in adopting the stability law, which force the ministry to deny the permit, the Italian state is expropriating Rockhopper of their right to be granted the production concession. All right, I claim that there are some fatal flaws on this reasoning. On the fact, the first point was very hotly debated. So the lawyers of the Italian state and some expert witnesses say that the decree, the Article 16 of Decree 4084 was not enforced. I'm not taking any position on who was right or wrong. The only point I'm making is that the tribunal doesn't have a reasoning to conclude that the decree is enforced. So if you read the award, you see that in the paragraphs preceding this conclusion, what they do is basically copy-pasting what the respondent and selectively so and the claimant say. There is no autonomous reasoning there. So this in investment law is a reason for an annulment procedure. And I'm just adding to that. Think of the Chevron Ecuador case where the court of Ecuador was found to be corrupt because it plagiarized a certain memorial. Now, here in this particular award, the only discernible reasoning is a set of quotes from the claimant. The only difference from plagiarism is that the quotes are explicit, so it is acknowledged the source. Incidentally, never has such a permit been granted within 15 days in the history of Italy. All right, but I don't take any position on that. The second fatal flaw is even if that article was enforced, the legal consequences that follow from the article are far from clear. So what I argue is that the release of an IA, so this environmental integrated authorization, cannot be equated to a right to a permit. This is a gross misunderstanding of Italian law by the arbitration tribunal. Why do I say that? Because IA is a conditional act. So if we read in the award, passage from this document is a degree that is given to the company. We see, for example, that the IA decrees the environmental compatibility of the project on the condition that the prescriptive and administrative requirements indicated in annex, etc., are fulfilled. So it presumes that there are conditions that the state, the ministry that received that document, has to check. And we all know what it means to check a document. Like to check an exam, it takes more than 15 days, let alone the number of documentation that were required in this case. I just mentioned one of the last documents submitted by the claimant, which was a report on health, safety, environment and waste management on 14 December 2015. So I don't think any automatic right, and in saying that I have been studying back a little bit of Italian law, there seems to be quite some shared understanding there, but even by just the reading of the decree, how can you conclude that there is an automatic right that can follow from a document where conditions are attached? Because if there is a condition, the condition can be violated, in which case you're not supposed to issue the permit. The second thing is, it is possible to legally challenge an IA. So there is a ruling of an Italian administrative tribunal of 2021 that has challenged, and they got it, they challenge on correct base this decree. So it cannot flow from an act an automatic right to a permit if the act is not and cannot be constitutive or rights. Then I make a tangential point and I draw to a close because we are already behind time. A tangential point is what we see here is also a case of asymmetric formalism. or what we could call pro-polluter formalism. Basically, in this award, to establish an expropriation, we see that all the argumentative edifice is around this rule of the 15 days timelines. If you really scrape off all the surface of what is in the award, this is what it is. There is no analysis of environmental rationality of the 2016 stability law, nothing about the AYA, on which there were a lot of commentaries, which I've been reading. I don't think our colleagues on the arbitration tribunal did. It was all about this. And one could say, well, that's investment law. Dura lex, sed lex, the law is harsh. But look at other cases like TechMed. In that case, an arbitration tribunal says that, even if the company violated some laws, and these were quite important laws in my view, the arbitration tribunal applies a proportionality analysis. Those violations were not so important. So the law of the country sometimes can be looked up and, you can adjust it. And as a coincidence, if we contrast these cases, they are, one hyper-formalist pro-polluter and the other is, loose and pro-polluters again. So that's a bit peculiar. So my conclusions from just the analysis on expropriation is that if the Rubicon was crossed, it is through these awards that is crossed. This is really a declaration of war. Such type of awards are Exhibit A for the anti-democratic, anti-environmental nature of ECT. It cannot send but one message: big time to exit ECT and other ISDS treaties, not to sign contracts with ISDS clauses. And if you're not in the ECT, do not join. Beware of the work of the ECT Secretariat. That's a dangerous one. And that's where I stop sharing. Thank you. Anil? Yeah.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was a very fascinating introduction and a really interesting analysis. A lot of the gaps that don't appear in the award, you filled them for us. So thanks a lot for that. So I will be, I'll introduce myself. I'm sorry. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Essex Law School, and I am a co-director of the Essex Business and Human Rights Project. I've been working on investment law and human rights issues, business and human rights issues for the last 10 years or so. And I will be looking at the environmental aspects of the award, basically following on from what Alessandra talked about. I will just focus on from what perspective the tribunal appears to have looked at all the environmental considerations that were raised by Italy in the award. And I would like to just note that one of the arbitrators was Pierre-Marie Dupuy, who's a very, very well-known leading international environmental law academic. So that, again, that's something that we talked about with Tony and Alessandra a couple of days ago. It's quite telling. It's quite interesting also to see that and also the impact of him being on the tribunal is somewhat visible from the analysis, but it hasn't eventually impacted the outcome of the dispute. So that's another interesting fact, because there's been a lot of discussion around the role of arbitrators in investment treaty arbitration, and the fact that many come from a commercial law background and they might be kind of looking at issues from that perspective, whereas if we had more people with expertise in public international law, international environmental law, we would maybe be having different decisions, which this and many other cases actually that are in similar kind of situations show that isn't necessarily the case. So I'm gonna also share my screen quickly. Wait. Okay, can you see my presentation?
We see that you are sharing the screen, but we see only black. Is it maybe because I pinned you, or?
Could be try unpinning. Yeah.
Could be.
Try unpinning. See if it changes.
Oh.
Okay, I will try that again.
Otherwise, if you want, you can send us, and then we can share it for you.
No, I think I'll be able to do that. It's just that I haven't used the correct screen here, I think. I had a really nice photo of penguins, so I'm gonna... Okay, so 1 second. Right. Okay, is that...
No.
No? Okay, I might...
You want to send us?
Yes, I will do that. So I am going to send it. Who should I send it to?
Abdurrahman, maybe, because we are on his...
Okay. Sorry about this. Okay, I just sent it to him. So I was just gonna start with until the PowerPoint is up. So yesterday we were out for dinner, and a friend of mine told me that Rockhopper is the name of these penguins that are indigenous to the Falklands Islands, and that they've been at threat of extinction because of oil spills from offshore drilling. So it's quite ironic that this company's name is basically Rockhopper Oil Exploration, and they did publicly state that they will be using the funds that they generated from this arbitration to fund their projects in the Falklands Islands, fund their oil exploration projects. So that kind of brings us a bit more context about this award and generally issues around fossil fuels, investment arbitration, etc. Okay, there we are. Thank you for that. So these are the penguins. So if we could go to the second slide, please. Thank you.
Shall I do, or?
Oh.
No, it's...
So I wanna basically talk a bit about, in the slides, I only included quotes from the award, just to kind of talk through them, and maybe we can think through them together in this roundtable that are emblematic of the problems that we're seeing with investment treaties and investment treaty arbitration. So there's been a lot of discussion around, in the process of reforming investment treaties, on the impact of investment treaties on states' right to regulate. So there's now a trend of including in investment treaties a provision that reaffirms that right. That, like CETA, for example, states that the state has a right to regulate in the public interest, which does not necessarily need affirmation in a treaty, because that is an inherent right of a state. But there was this thinking that this might help states to rely on that type of provision in investment treaty disputes to challenge claims and to demonstrate that they were simply exercising their police powers. But what this award actually shows us, and there are quite a few awards that came before this one also show us, is that the fact that the state has police powers and that it's exercising its right to regulate does not prevent it from having to compensate for the damages that investors allegedly suffer as a result of that type of regulation. So this is a quote from this one that's on the screen, is from actually Pierre-Marie Dupuy. In his, he wrote a separate opinion, which isn't a dissenting opinion, but just as he wanted to clarify, I think, a few things. And so what he says is that he acknowledges the legitimate objectives of Italy in passing the law that banned oil extraction within the 12 nautical miles of its coast. But then he goes on to say that this is a case that is being decided under the Energy Charter Treaty, and that the tribunal is only competent to assess whether or not the state has breached its investment law obligations. And that specific analysis does not take into consideration whether the state was exercising its right to regulate in pursuance of legitimate policy objectives, like the protection of the environment. So that kind of is reaffirmed here. And during our meeting a couple of days ago, we were talking about whether, if this case was decided under CETA, whether the outcome would be different, because CETA has a kind of an explicit provision on the right to regulate, and there are some explicit limitations on what might amount to indirect expropriation. It does say that legitimate exercise of authority by states to regulate in the public interest that are non-discriminatory, etc., would not constitute indirect expropriation, except in rare circumstances. So I think that kind of qualification there, that there's some rare circumstances in which host state behavior could still constitute indirect expropriation, opens up possibilities of investment tribunals deciding that, here is a rare circumstance. And I think what Alessandra told us does kind of show that here the tribunal focused on a very specific provision of the law in Italy that may or may not be valid in Italy. That's not very clear from the award, although there are experts that have been cross-examined on Italian constitutional law. But again, I don't think their answers were very clear either. But the tribunal has decided that that law was applicable, and that the meaning of law was such that the investor, even though they did not have a permit to operate, to produce oil, they had a right to obtain a permit. And that right was basically expropriated in this particular instance. So if we could move to the next slide. We then, again, going back to the body of the award itself, so the previous one was from the separate opinion. This is the opening of the award. So the tribunal spans 3 pages of the award. The first 3 pages are primarily dedicated to the tribunal showing its own sensitivities to the issues around environmental regulation, and the fact that they respect the state's choices, and that they understand that people living in the area were understandably very concerned about this activity, and all of that was legitimate. But again, this is a case under the ECT. This is an investment treaty case. We have to look at whether the actions of the state have led to a breach of their investment treaty obligations. So again, looking at it in isolation and not really, even though there's a lot of talk, there is a lot of references in the award to the legitimacy of these environmental objectives, that still does not make a difference. It still leads to a finding of breach and finding of indirect expropriation. And I think, and Tony is going to talk about the quantum and questions around the amount of damages awarded. If the amount of damages awarded weren't so extraordinary, one may not have such massive problems with this finding. But because the consequences of finding breach are so extensive, that it just makes the ignorance of the environmental considerations in the final decision quite awful, as Alessandra said. It might be lawful, but it still is awful. So can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So that was on kind of almost the futility of relying on police powers or the right to regulate to defend the state. There is not really room for allowing states to rely on those defenses, because what the tribunal has essentially said is, even if you were pursuing the most acceptable environmental objectives, this is still an expropriation and you still have to compensate of an investment that never actually started operating. And so that is the other part of the coin. And that takes me again back to the separate opinion of Pierre-Marie Dupuy. He talks about, so the tribunal itself does not deal with the question of fair and equitable treatment standards. They decide that there was expropriation, and they decide that there is no need to consider the question of fair and equitable treatment standard, which is slightly odd because usually a finding of expropriation has a higher threshold than a finding of a breach of fair and equitable treatment standard, especially based on the legitimate expectations of the investor, because that is, especially in cases like this where you don't even have an operational investment, where there hasn't been a permit that was actually granted to the investor to produce oil. Typically, investors would argue that they had an expectation, they had a legitimate and reasonable expectation to obtain that permit, and that would lead to a finding of a FET breach. Whereas in this case, the separate opinion explains how there was no finding of a fair and equitable standard breach, because he says that the investor could not have reasonably expected to obtain that permit. And that is to me mind-blowing, because on the one hand, they're finding expropriation on the basis that there was this right that was created by this decree that Alessandra talked about. But on the other hand, they're saying that the company could not have reasonably or legitimately expected a positive response from the government. The government was able to show that they had made no promises, and that the granting of an exploration permit was in no way indicative that they would also get the exploitation permits, and that there was clear dangers of the projects, the project being, an offshore drilling project, and it was very close to the coast. And so the investor could have no expectations that are entitled to protection. Yet somehow the investor had an investment that was expropriated. So this, to me, I mean, I would like to hear everyone else's thoughts, but this was quite a striking thing to read. After reading the award, coming to this separate opinion and reading this was quite interesting. So I don't know how the two things can be reconciled. It doesn't make sense to me, but I'd be happy to hear other people's views on this. Could we move to the next slide? Thank you. Again, continuing and this will link to the question around damages that Tony will talk about. But continuing again, the separate opinion says that there was kind of there could have been no expectation of intrinsic profitability of the project, because the company had already bought the project at a really low price, a relatively low price, and that there was real risks of even if they were to obtain the license, that the project wouldn't have a long life cycle, that it would have been cancelled at some later point in time. So again, holding these views and then deciding that the company is entitled to lost profits for a certain amount of time for a project that has never started, it is quite again, it's quite striking to me. I'm finding it difficult to kind of reconcile with the findings of the main award. And then the final thing that I want to comment on is the next slide, is the tribunal's treatment of certain environmental principles. So at some point, the tribunal looks at the precautionary principle. And again, one of the arbitrators is a leading international environmental law professor. So it's kind of interesting to see their views being presented in this award. And I actually went and looked into their leading textbook. So they've co-authored a textbook on international environmental law where they talk about the precautionary principle. And then there is the mention of the precautionary principle in the award. And it's difficult to reconcile the two approaches. So one of the interesting things in the award is that the tribunal says that Italy, when they asked for this enhanced environmental review that Alessandra talked about, that Italy has then applied the precautionary principle to ask for this enhanced environmental assessment. And once the state approved that, once the relevant authorities approved that environmental assessment, then they can't go back and apply the precautionary principle at a later date again. So they're saying that this would not be appropriate because this is just moving the goalposts. But the nature of the precautionary principle itself isn't, its evolution. It evolves. So science evolves, and our knowledge evolves, and our positions evolve, and the reactions of local communities evolve. Although in this case, there's been the same opposition to this project from the very beginning, but this is an evolutionary process. And saying that, and when I look at the textbook on international environmental law that was authored by Pierre-Marie Dupuy, it does actually refer to the uncertainty on substantive content of the precautionary principle in international law. So there is no certainty as to how it can be operationalized in different contexts. But what we know is that this is an evolutionary process. And so it's not, set in stone that you apply the principle once and then you can't then go back and apply it again as a state. But more than that, I was a bit puzzled by Italy's reference and the tribunal's reference to the precautionary principle, but because that's a principle that you apply when the science isn't very clear. So you're taking you're being proactive. Whereas I think here, what Italy is doing is applying the principle of prevention. So because we know the dangers of fossil fuel extraction, we know the dangers to nature of offshore oil drilling. So there is no question of here uncertainty. We know that this is dangerous, and we know that fossil fuels are linked to climate change, right? That's all kind of established science, and the prevention principle it requires states to exercise due diligence. So again, due diligence is a process that's an ongoing process. It's not a one-off thing that you would do and then you kind of definitively decide how to react. So it's all evolutionary. But the tribunal has approached it in a different way and thought that Italy's reactions could not be legitimately based on the precautionary principle, because they've applied it once and that's it. You can't go back to it again. That seems to be their view, and that I don't think is in concert with what environmental law. International environmental law and European Union's own environmental law principles expect from states. And then can we go to the next slide, please? So what I think is more underlying this decision of the tribunal is their kind of distaste of political debates and civil participation. So it seems like the tribunal assumed that Italy's actions were not necessarily rational, even though the tribunal says, yes, we do respect that the state has a right to regulate and there was a legitimate environmental consideration here. But that specific act in 2016 that led to the rejection of the permit, they say, was more motivated by the political and civic engagements rather than by the application of the precautionary principle, because that you can only apply that principle once and Italy has already applied it. So the only reason why Italy has finally rejected the application of the investor was that there was political pressure. And the way these type of civil disobedience instances, like civil engagement, stakeholder participation, all of these are part of environmental governance. But it seems like, looking at past awards as well, it's almost like a dirty word in investment treaty arbitration, that if there is some kind of political engagement, if there's protests, if there is civic engagements, if there's stakeholder participation that inform policymaking, states end up being penalized for actually listening to their citizens. And that, I think, is one of the perverse, as Alessandra was saying, this is one of the perverse aspects of investment law. And that's why I think it's incompatible with questions around environmental justice, climate justice, climate change action. All of these require listening to the people as well as to the science. So I think I'm going to finish there and pass the floor to Tony. Thank you so much for organizing, Alessandra, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much. Sorry. You done for our slide?
No, so I haven't prepared any slides, unfortunately.
Good.
So you can just see my big face on your screen. So hi everybody. So I'm Tony Marzal. I teach at the University of Glasgow, and that's where I'm connecting from. Thank you, Alessandra, for the invitation to participate here. It's a real pleasure, and I'm very happy to be able to discuss with you and meet you, and to discuss and meet Anil also. I hope I look forward to our future conversation. So Much has already been said, and I'm going to try to avoid repetition as much as possible. I've been asked to focus on the question of compensation and how this is calculated here. So, and this, I think, is perhaps the most, at least at the sort of technical level, this is perhaps the most notable contribution of the award to the development of international investment law. And it is, I believe, also a question that is much more central to ISDS than we often assume. I think we try to often avoid engaging with questions of valuation, questions of calculation of compensation, because they seem very technical, very financial, and therefore foreign to the kind of central legal and political struggles, conflicts, discussions that seem more essential to the field. So I'm going to be trying to be as clear as possible in my explanations, and of course, if I'm not, do feel free to ask questions afterwards. My first point, perhaps Anil has already been touching on it, but I want to engage a little bit more with it, which this concerns what I think is the tribunal's central contention in this decision, which is that, the contention is that all this decision does is to compensate the investor monetarily for the loss of its investment. This decision does not in any way interfere with Italy's sovereign rights to regulate, the extraction of fossil fuels, right? This is the key argument found in the award. And on this point, I would say that there is something quite remarkable about the award, which is already evident from what Anil has been presenting, which is the defensiveness on the part of the tribunal. Now, they seem to be, very aware of how bad this all looks. How terrible a sight it is for a tribunal to be, this day and age, penalizing a ban on offshore oil extraction, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to persuade us, this decision is not at all coming from a place of lack of sensitivity towards the climate emergency. Incidentally, I have to also say that nothing at all is said on the democratic dimension of this process, which tells you perhaps that, they're not even, this doesn't even register as a preoccupation for them. Anyway, so the tribunal majority, so it's composed of Klaus Reichert and Charles Poncet. So they signal, and Anil has already put on a slide a few of these remarkable sentences. They say, they're acutely sensitive, that these are strongly held civic, environmental, political views, etc. And, they say, the outcome, now I'm quoting again, the outcome of this case passes no judgment whatsoever on the legitimacy or validity of those views, that the award is not a victory for one side or the other in the environmental debate, etc. Now, it's even more remarkable, therefore, that the state-appointed arbitrator, so Pierre-Marie Dupuis, who signs with his co-arbitrators on every substantive issue of the decision, nevertheless feels the need to file an individual opinion expressing his regret that more emphasis has not been given in the decision to the context of the dispute, right? And he even chooses to remind us that, hey, I wrote a book on environmental law, so surely, I'm the good guy here, right? And again, insist on this idea that this decision is not at all about the right to regulate the environment and does not question the public nature of the considerations leading to, the ban on offshore oil extraction. Now, if this were all true, if a right to compensation did not actually impact environmental policy, then of course, no ISDS award would ever affect any regulatory powers, right? Since monetary compensation is really the only available remedy in investor-state arbitration, right? So nor would speeding tickets have any effect on driving, nor would the damages for medical negligence have any impact on medical practice, etc., etc. But of course, this is not true. This is deeply disingenuous on their part. The regulatory freeze of ISDS awards, and in this one in particular, is very real, very well documented. And in this case, Alessandra has already mentioned that Italy had hesitated in 2012 about whether to create or not exceptions for offshore oil drilling, precisely because they were afraid that claims might follow, right? So it's rather obvious that driving up the cost of keeping fossil fuels underground can only result in more fossil fuels coming out of the ground, which is exactly what we are urgently and repeatedly being warned against if global warming is not to exceed the 1.5 Celsius target that we hear so much about. Anyway, so the central issue is therefore, how much compensation must Italy pay to comply with the Energy Charter Treaty? Or in other words, what is the price, according to the tribunal, of banning oil extraction? And everything is going to hinge on this, really. So to understand the significance of the award in this respect, we have to, as Alessandra was asking us the other day, have to zoom in to the, sort of the more technical aspects of valuation before zooming out to sort of examine its broader significance. And so what we see in the quantum part of the award, quantum being the typical sort of term that we use to refer to the calculation of compensation, is that tribunal's reasoning reflects a highly financialized understanding of what compensation is about, not a legal understanding, and that this leads to a hugely inflated award. Now, the first question that any judge, really, any adjudicatory body that is asked to calculate compensation, first question that they must address is the following. What is it that the victim lost? What is the actionable harm on whose value compensation will be based, right? So a legal approach to this question would normally require that we focus on the valuation of the legal rights, the legal titles that were unlawfully taken away from the victim, here the investor, right? And now, in this case, the Rockhopper Award, in its section on liability prior to quantum, was very, very clear about what those rights were. As is repeated several times with a lot of insistence, the investor had only, quote, a right to be granted the production concession and not the concession itself, right? And this distinction is presented by a tribunal as critical, again, I'm quoting the tribunal, when discussing liability. So we would therefore expect that this distinction is also also influences its reasoning on quantum. That is not, however, what happens. The distinction, as soon as we cross the Rubicon of quantum, simply disappears. And instead, what the tribunal does is to treat this question of quantum as a purely financial question. That is to say, what Rockhopper lost was not a legal title, but an investment. So, and compensation must therefore be based not on the value of that legal title, but on the value of that investment. So that financial asset. So there's no question of a valuation of that supposed, right to be granted a production concession. Right? Now, this distinction between sort of legal and financial, it's not just a theoretical thing. If the tribunal had focused on valuing the right that had been allegedly terminated by the state or taken away, it would have had to consider that right's, specific legal construction under the Italian regime, which brought it into existence, right? So, for instance, a key question would be, can such a right be sold to third parties? right? If it cannot, and presumably here it cannot, for a right to be granted a concession was necessarily specific to Rockhopper, because there was only Rockhopper established its technical capacity to operate the field, etc., and not anybody else under the supervision of the controlling public authority, right? If that right cannot be sold, then it makes no sense here to speak of a market value for that right to a concession, right? Since, well, technically, the market value of an asset that is not marketable is technically zero. Now, none of this is, of course, mentioned at all by the tribunal in its assessment of quantum. So in its view, what the investor suffered was not the deprivation of a legal title, but the deprivation of a purely financial deprivation. Okay. So that's the first. And the second question that is key is, how does one translate the victim's loss into an equivalent sum of money? How do you go from one to the other? In other words, how do you do a valuation of that loss? And now the tribunal resorted to DCF valuation. So DCF, for those of you who don't know, stands for discounted cash flows. It is a valuation method that essentially locates the value of anything, the value of any asset, in its future profitability, rather than in any amounts that have been historically incurred in acquiring or maintaining that asset, right? So the way it works is you first add up all the expected cash flows expected to be generated by that asset in the future, and then you subject that total amount of income streams, expected income streams, to a discount factor to take into account the risk associated with those streams. So the risk of those expected cash streams not actually materializing, right? And that's what produces the present value of the asset, right? Now, there are two main issues with using the DCF method in legal adjudication. DCF method, which tends to lead to much higher amounts, and in this case, this is confirmed. Now, the two issues are the following. The first is that the DCF method is notoriously prone to manipulation. Any small tweak in any of the inputs that go into the DCF formula can result in huge variations of the final result. That would be it. So, a single percentage increase in the discount factor can produce differences of hundreds of millions in any asset, right? The second big issue is that DCF is necessarily speculative, as it involves predicting what the future will bring. And in particular, when we're talking about oil, of course, this involves predicting what oil prices are going to be looking like down the line, which, of course, we all know is impossible. Now, both of these reasons explain why international lawyers were traditionally resisted DCF. It was seen as fundamentally speculative, fundamentally unreliable, particularly where the investment in question didn't yet have a history of operation, a history of generating profits, right? Now, what's striking about the Rockhopper Award is that both of these reasons that sort of advocate against DCF were very intensely present in the case. So, for one, first of all, production had not yet begun. So there was not yet any history of profit making on the part of this particular oil platform, right? So any prediction about what those future cash flows are going to be was necessarily highly speculative. But secondly, Rockhopper's own financial expert in the case had inadvertently showed just how manipulable DCF is. In fact, it produced several valuations, a range of valuations, and the spread of the valuations was a whopping 1.5 billion euros, right? It said this particular asset is worth anywhere in between around 50 million euros to 1.5 billion euros, right? And furthermore, there was even a third important reason to ignore DCF in this particular case, which was the fact that Rockhopper had acquired the investment only around 17 months prior to the alleged expropriation for a mere 36 million euros, right? So we had real data in this case about how a real market transaction had priced the asset, right? Which would make it unnecessary to engage in the kind of speculative formulas of DCF, right? Nevertheless, the tribunal chooses to place its trust on DCF, leading to a valuation of 5 times the amount that Rockhopper had paid. So 185 million euros, on top of which you have to add compound interest. So question is, how is this possible? Now, the reason is, again, I think found in a widespread view of quantum, which is here fully endorsed, enthusiastically endorsed by the 3 arbitrators. And again, I think it is, to insist on something that Anil said, extremely significant that even the state-appointed arbitrator was happy to subscribe to this. The reason, I think, is found in the view of these quantum assessments as a purely financial exercise rather than a legal one. If the tribunal had approached the quantification of damages as a legal matter, it would have had to consider whether this, the right that had supposedly been taken away, the right that was supposedly held by the investor, which is, remember, a mere right to be granted a concession, that right covered all of the concessions predicted future profits, right? Now, if that's the question, the proper legal question, then the proper legal answer is, of course, no, there is no such right. Even if those future profits were not seen as too speculative, which I think they are here, too speculative to be legally protected, even if that were not the case, it still is undeniable that the state has is entitled to moderate those future profits down the line through, let's say, tax increases, etc. Right? And yet the tribunal here, instead of approaching valuation in the manner of a legal adjudicator, chooses to see this question as a purely financial matter, and so justifies the use of DCF on the basis of the fact that, well, it says, well, the fossil fuel industry usually uses DCF for its own investment decisions. It says, well, we also have prestigious financial services companies such as Rothschild and Canaccord, the 2 that it cites, using DCF. Even the Italian government engages in DCF valuation sometimes, etc., etc. So the fact that in all these instances, DCF is used to support investment decisions rather than to adjudicate claims for compensation, which was the task given to the tribunal, is not at all considered, of course. The distance between what is legal and what is financial entirely disappears. So, to conclude, I think that this award ultimately shows the extent to which participants in ISDS, and particular arbitrators, inhabit a completely different intellectual world from a legal point of view. And the fact that the state appointed arbitrator had nothing to say about the way, no objection to the way compensation was calculated, and its impact on environmental concerns, I think is extremely illuminating. As a last thought, I would say that this award fits well, I think, or confirms the illusory, or fits well within the model of greenwashing and green capitalism. Now, the view that is implicitly held in this award is that the energy transition must be accomplished So they're saying, of course, you are feel free to regulate fossil fuel extraction. However, it must be done in ways that do not involve any cost for the fossil fuel industry, right? Or any redistribution of wealth to those that are on the receiving end of the climate crisis, right? But not only that, furthermore, transition must be accomplished in ways that create new opportunities for wealth accumulation on the part of the fossil fuel industry. And here is illustrated by the fact that ultimately, via compensation, they're receiving more than they would normally have received under the normally applicable legal regime. So this concludes, and I hope we can have some time for discussion.
Thank you, Tony. That was really terrific. I think we can open the floor for questions. We are, of course, running late, but maybe we can stay 5-10 minutes extra. I see here in the physical room, and in the other room, everybody can leave. So the floor. Yes, we will stop recording so that everybody feels free to, ask silly questions. What am I doing? Yes. Okay. So the recording is.